Hi there. In this short presentation, I want to walk you through writing a thesis statement. I'm going to offer some tips for writing clear and focused thesis statements. So first off, if you've never really thought about thesis statements or aren't exactly sure what it is, basically your thesis statement serves as your essay's main idea. So it identifies to your reader in one sentence what the essay is about. So if your reader read your essay, there should be one sentence that gives the general idea of what your essay is talking about. Before you start drafting a thesis statement, you need to consider your response to the essay question. So for the essays in this class, the nice thing is that you have a question that you're answering. So that makes it a bit easier. It becomes a little bit tricky when you don't have a question to respond to. But since you have a question to respond to, then your answer to the question is a good way to think about your thesis statement. And I'll talk about that in the next slide. But before we move on, I want to talk about the difference between your thesis statement and then the purpose of your essay. So consider the purpose of your essay. And the purpose of your essay is what you want your reader to understand after reading your essay. And although the purpose of your essay and the thesis statement are closely connected, the two are not the same. So at the end of this presentation, I'm going to give you an example of a thesis statement, a strong thesis statement, and in that thesis statement I talk about overuse of technology. And so the thesis statement, as you'll see it, is a clear sentence that says what my essay is about. But the purpose of that essay would be to kind of warn my readers, to make them aware of what overuse of technology can do. So if you notice there, I kind of have two different ideas. The purpose of an essay like that is to give the reader details about what the overuse of technology can do so that they will be aware of those consequences. But that's not what my thesis statement is going to state. My thesis statement is going to state what the essay is about. So just make sure that you have those two clear in your head. They're very much related, but if you had to describe each one, you should have two different answers. So when you're thinking about your essay, you're thinking about, okay, what do you want your reader to walk away understanding? That's your purpose. And that usually goes unstated. What goes clearly stated is your thesis statement, which is one sentence that your reader should be able to identify. And think about this tip. A strong thesis statement surprises readers with something new or challenging. You don't want your thesis statement to be something obvious because it makes your essay boring to read. Actually, if you're presenting information to your reader that they already know, they might not really be interested in reading your work. So you do want to make your work interesting. And if you want to state something obvious, that's fine. Just make sure that all the supporting details that you offer after you state an obvious reason, those should be interesting to read. So let's think about the question that you're answering for this essay. So you're being asked to answer this question. What should our main concern be about our use of technology? And if we were in a face-to-face class right now and we were working on this in the classroom, I would probably have you take 2 to 5 minutes and answer this question in 3 to 5 sentences. So you might want to do that. Or at any point, if you find yourself drawing a blank, if you are telling yourself, I don't know what I'm going to write about, I have nothing to say, I would say pause this video, think about this question, and just answer it. What do you think our concern should be about technology? And when I say concern, it could be either something that we think of as positive or something that we think of as negative. It doesn't necessarily have to be something bad. Maybe because of our dependence of technology, you can think of something positive to say. And I've talked quite a bit about your reader and your audience. So, as I started this presentation, so I want you to think about your reader and your audience. And as you read the paper prompt for this assignment, I described to you that your that your audience, right, is an informed audience. It's an informed audience that wants to know more about this topic. And those details are important because that tells you that if your audience is interested about this topic, then they probably know a little bit about this topic. So you do want to make them interested in what you have to say. You want to draw them in to your ideas. And whenever you're writing an essay, don't just think about what ideas you're putting on paper. There also should be instances during the process when you're thinking about your reader and you're thinking about what information they need in order to best understand the point that you're trying to make. And you're also thinking about whether what you're stating is clear or not. So think about your reader's needs, in other words. So writing is not an isolated exercise, even though it feels isolated whenever you're actually drafting essays. But it is a social exercise because you, at the end of the drafting process, you have an audience or a reader that reads your work. And for this exercise, you'll have at least 2 people that are reading your work. You'll have your peer reviewer and you'll have me. So there are at least 2 readers, 2 audiences that you're writing for. And as you're thinking about thesis statement and your audience, I want you to consider these 2 ideas and fill in the blank. So before reading my essay, my readers probably think this way about my topic. So what is it that you think readers know about, think about, opine about technology? And list those things. So those should be the obvious things, right? And then consider this. After reading my essay, my readers will think this different way about my topic. So what is it that you're adding to the conversation that your reader will take away and will think about the topic in a different way? And when I say different way, I don't necessarily mean that you're going to radically change their conception about this topic. You might offer something small, but even if it's a small contribution to the topic, that's enough. So don't focus on trying to completely change their views or to introduce something that's completely different to them, but just consider what have you learned after reading and listening to what your sources have said about this topic, from your observations, from your personal experiences that you bring to this conversation. What could you talk about that will have your reader thinking differently about this topic? And that should help you start drafting an answer to the question at least. Once you answer the question, and I mean the essay question, this one, once you answer the question, and let's say you answered it in 3 to 4 sentences, think of how you can summarize those 3 to 4 sentences in one sentence
that clearly states what your essay is going to be about. And another consideration is that you want to give your thesis tension. This means that you want to pull the reader towards new and unfamiliar ideas. And that's why I asked you to think about these two considerations. Because as you think about what your reader already knows about this topic, and then you think about what you want them to understand after reading your essay, this should help you start considering the new and unfamiliar ideas that you can offer to your reader, that you have to add to this conversation. A strategy for creating tension is to contrast your answer with what you believe your reader's common answer to the question would be. So for example, many people believe X, the common, widely accepted view, right, about a certain topic. But then that second part of this example, this is where you add the tension. And this is where you say, but I am going to show you this. So because we're talking about technology, you could say something like this. Many people believe that technology is overused, right? That's a common view. A lot of people think that technology is overused. But I am going to show you that the benefits to technology are really helpful when educating young people, or something specific like that. So I'm drawing my reader's attention away from this widely accepted idea that technology is overused to this idea that technology can be beneficial. And not only can it be beneficial in general, but I'm adding another specific element to this, which is that it can be beneficial in an educational setting. So it's helping people in their education. So that's being very specific, and I'm adding tension. So as you're drafting your thesis statement and you're responding to the question, and I've offered two examples of thesis statements on this slide, and right now I'm going to talk about which one works better than the other one. But before I do that, you'll notice that I use language from the question, the essay question. And that's okay, right, to say that, to use language from the question. Our main concern about our use of technology should be, and I complete the question. What you don't want to do is assume that your reader knows what question you're answering. So that's something that's really important to keep in mind. As you're drafting your essay, write it as if your reader doesn't know what question you're responding. So you shouldn't immediately jump in other words, to answering this question when you start drafting your essay. You should write it in a complete sentence. You should think about it as if you're introducing this topic in a new way to your reader. Okay, so let's look at these two examples that I have here. This top one, our main concern about our use of technology is that we rely on technology too much. I have it labeled there and I say this is a thesis without tension. So even though this thesis, it works, it's very common. It's a common way of looking at the topic. It's not adding anything new to the conversation. So if you look at the second one though, there's added tension because there's more specific details that are added to the idea. And actually I move away from the idea that we rely on technology too much and talk about kind of a different topic that's related to technology. So I say, although many think that people rely on technology too much, there are large groups of people across the U.S. who still have limited access to technology. So if I were to read this thesis statement in an essay, this is a strong thesis because it tells me that the focus of this essay is going to not necessarily be on how people rely on technology too much, although maybe the writer will talk about this a little bit because they include it in the thesis statement, but they're going to focus a lot more on how people still have limited access to technology. And I came up with this thesis because after we've switched to online learning and remote learning, it's become really apparent how there's a digital divide in our country, that so many people think that everybody has access to internet, right? That a lot of people have access to fast internet at home, and that's not necessarily the case. A lot of people don't. A lot of people have limited access. A lot of people have very slow internet access, which becomes important when their work depends on it, when their education depends on it. So those would be ideas that I would talk about in my essay. I could have also still stayed on topic. So if I turn your attention back to this idea of our main concern about our use of technology is that we rely on technology too much, I could have still used that idea, but just added tension to it to make it more specific. I could have said something like, our main concern about our use of technology is that we rely on technology too much, and it has changed the way it has impacted the attention our attention spans. So that would add something specific to it. So I could rewrite that top sentence to say, our main concern about our use of technology is that we rely on technology too much, and it has even impacted our attention spans. So that means that most of my essay is going to be focused on that part of the topic, that it has impacted our attention spans. So I'm drawing your attention to the details in both of those examples of what the essay would be about, because a good thesis statement for a writer helps them keep focus. So once you review our rubric for this assignment, you'll see that one area of the grading rubric is focus, that you're not getting off topic. So you can still get off. So let's say I'm talking about technology in an essay, and I start talking about how the older generation disapproves of the younger generation's overuse of technology. That gets me off topic a little bit if I'm sticking to one of these two thesis statements, because that's not what my thesis statement stated, right? So if that's the point I wanted to make, I needed to have introduced that point in my thesis statement. So a good thesis statement, a writer will use it as a guide to help them start drafting their essay and help them not get off topic. Okay, so I will end this presentation here. I hope this presentation helps you start drafting a thesis statement to your They Say essay assignment. Let me know if you have any questions.